My name is Victoria Vance. I was 22 years old when my mother stood in front of 70 guests at our family's dinner table, raised her crystal glass, looked me directly in the eye, and told everyone present that I was an ungrateful, unstable fraud who had destroyed our family's business. 9 years later, I walked into her lavish second wedding holding a single black leather document case and dismantled the grand lie she had spent a decade building in front of 200 people. Have you ever been made the villain in a story you didn't write? Have you ever watched a parent twist the truth so effortlessly that even the people who raised you stayed silent just to protect their own comfort? For 9 years, my father, my aunts, and my cousins lived under my mother's absolute emotional control. They watched her cast me out into the cold, and not one of them raised a voice to defend me. But paper carries a memory long after people choose to forget, and when I stepped into the grand rotunda of her wedding, I didn't come to cause a scene or yell. I came to present her new groom with undeniable evidence. The silver spoon and the public execution. The night my family broke apart didn't happen in secret behind closed doors. It was staged with meticulous precision over silver cutlery, floral arrangements, and vintage wine at my parents' 25th wedding anniversary gala. My mother, Eleanor Vance, was a woman obsessed with the architecture of public perception. To the outside world, she was the epitome of suburban elegance, a devoted matriarch, a pillar of charitable committees, and the brilliant coordinator behind my father's successful architectural restoration firm, Vance & Associates. My father, Arthur Vance, was a quiet, gentle man whose hands were always faintly dusted with drafting chalk or aged wood polish. He was a brilliant craftsman who could restore a century-old Victorian entryway to pristine condition, but when it came to human conflict, he was entirely spineless. Eleanor ruled our home through calculated humiliation, subtle put-downs, and an unrelenting demand for absolute submission. I was 22 at the time, freshly graduated with a bachelor's degree in accounting and business systems. I had spent my summer helping my father digitize 30 years of firm paper archives, converting dusty physical ledgers into secure corporate databases. I wasn't the glamorous daughter Eleanor had hoped for. I preferred practical clothes, focused heavily on my studies, and rarely engaged in the high society performative gossip Eleanor prized. 2 weeks before the anniversary gala, while cross-referencing corporate tax filings with physical bank deposit slips from the previous fiscal year, I caught a terrifying anomaly. Over a period of 18 months, nearly $400,000 had been systematically funneled out of Vance & Associates' operational reserves. The money hadn't been lost to bad investments or market downturns. It had been transferred into a series of shell accounts registered under a holding entity called Vance Heritage LLC, an entity my father had never mentioned. The authorizing signatures on the wire transfers bore Eleanor's signature, along with a secondary signature listed under my name as corporate secretary. I had never been appointed corporate secretary. I had never signed a single wire transfer. When I privately confronted my father in his workshop, showing him the bank printouts, he went deathly pale. His hands shook so violently he dropped his drafting pencil. Before he could speak, Eleanor walked into the room. She didn't panic. She didn't offer a defense. She simply walked over, snatched the printouts from my hands, and told my father, "Leave us, Arthur. Victoria is having one of her episodes again." My father looked between his wife and his daughter, bowed his head, and walked out without saying a word. That evening, Eleanor met me in the hallway. Her eyes were as cold as slate. "You think you're smart because you can read a spreadsheet, Victoria?" she whispered, her voice laced with venom. "You're nothing. You exist in this family because I allow it. If you ever mention those documents again, I will make sure you don't have a name left to protect." I thought she meant she would cut me off financially. I didn't realize she was preparing a public execution. 2 weeks later, at the anniversary gala held at the town's private country club, Eleanor waited until dessert was served. The room was filled with 70 of the town's most prominent figures: city council members, real estate developers, my aunts, uncles, and cousins. Eleanor took the microphone at the head table, wiping away a tear that had been pre-rehearsed in the dressing room mirror. "Friends, family," Eleanor's voice echoed softly through the crystal chandeliers. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of 25 years of marriage. But a mother's first duty is truth, no matter how painful. She paused, turning her gaze directly toward where I sat near the back of the room. Over the past year, Our family business has suffered devastating financial betrayals, Eleanor announced, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. We discovered that confidential client records and capital funds were being systematically stolen from my husband's desk. I tried to shield the person responsible. I tried to offer grace. But when your own daughter, Victoria, uses her access to steal from her own father to fund her personal life, a family must choose integrity over enablements. Ken. The room gasped. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I had been struck in the chest with an iron bar. My cousins turned around in their chairs, staring at me with expressions of horror and disgust. My Aunt Evelyn covered her mouth. Victoria has always struggled with deep jealousy, Eleanor continued, her voice rising smoothly over the murmurs. Beauty skipped her, warmth skipped her, and now loyalty has skipped her as well. She has proven that she cares nothing for this family. I turned to my father, sitting right beside her. Dad, I whispered, my voice breaking. Dad, tell them, you know I didn't do this. Tell them about the holding company. Arthur Vance stared down at his silver fork. His jaw clenched, but he didn't lift his eyes. He didn't say a word. He sat in absolute cowardly silence, while his wife branded his daughter a thief in front of everyone we had ever known. I think it's best if you leave, Victoria, Eleanor said into the microphone, her tone dripping with faux maternal pity. We will pray for you. I stood up under the suffocating glare of 70 pairs of eyes. Whispers rippled through the tables like fire through dry grass. How could she do that to her parents? Unbelievable. She always was strange and cold. I walked out of the country club into the freezing autumn rain. I didn't go back to my parents' house. I walked 3 miles to the local bus depot, carrying only my handbag. I pulled out my phone, checked my balance. I had $94 in my personal account, and bought a one-way ticket on a midnight Greyhound bus to Chicago. I left behind my clothes, my childhood bedroom, and my family. But as the bus pulled away into the dark highway, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked glass, the grief turned into something hard and cold inside my chest. My mother had stolen my name to cover her own fraud. My father had traded my life for his own peace, and I swore to myself that night that I would never again allow my dignity to depend on people who required my destruction to feel safe. Exile, survival, and the grammar of Proof Chicago in November was unforgiving. The wind coming off Lake Michigan felt like razor blades against my face. I rented a tiny, sunless room on the 3rd floor of an old brownstone above a commercial bakery that smelled perpetually of scorched sugar and coal dust. The room had a single radiator that clanked all night, a creaky twin bed, and a shared bathroom down the hallway. My landlady was an elderly woman named Clara Vance, no relation to me, who had worked for 30 years as a probate record clerk for the Cook County court system. Clara was a woman with iron gray hair, sharp reading glasses, and zero patience for self-pity. The second night I was there, she caught me sitting on the fire escape stairs in the freezing cold, quietly crying into my jacket. She didn't offer me tea or a hug. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a woolen shawl, and said, "Tears don't pay the rent, girl, and they don't fix a broken contract. What happened to you?" I told her everything, the forged signatures, the anniversary dinner, my mother's public speech, and my father's silence. Clara listened without interrupting, her keen eyes watching me carefully. When I finished, she walked over, leaned against the iron railing, and said something that permanently reshaped my trajectory. People lie because words are cheap and air is free. They lie in speeches, they lie in churches, and they lie to their own blood. But paper has a grammar, child. Paper leaves a trail. Ink has weight, signatures have pressure, and dates leave shadows under a magnifying glass. If your mother built a house out of lies, stop trying to blow it down with your mouth. Go learn how to read the foundation. The next morning, Clara got me an entry-level position as an evening document scanner at a mid-sized forensic accounting firm in downtown Chicago. My job was mind-numbingly tedious. I spent 8 hours a night sitting under fluorescent lights in a windowless basement, feeding thousands of archived corporate records, canceled checks, land deeds, and bankruptcy filings into high-speed optical scanners. But I didn't just scan the pages. I read them. I studied how investigators traced hidden assets through multi-layered limited liability companies. I learned how forensic auditors detected altered ink density, microprinting discrepancies, backdated notary seals, and fraudulent wire routing numbers. I enrolled in night classes at the local university, funding my tuition through double shifts at the firm and surviving on instant noodles and cheap apples. Over the next 4 years, I earned my certification as a fraud examiner and forensic accounting specialist. While I was building my new life, my family back in Ohio completely erased me. My mother told relatives that I had disappeared into the underbelly of the city, out of shame for what I had done. My cousins blocked me on social media. My Aunt Evelyn sent a single, vicious letter 6 months after I left, telling me that I had broken my mother's health and that I should ask God for forgiveness before it was too late. My father sent a birthday card once a year. It was always mailed from a public post office box 2 towns over from our home, never from his house. Inside, there were no personal letters, no explanations, and no apologies. Just a pre-printed card with "Happy Birthday, Victoria," and his name, Dad, written in faint, trembling ink. No return address. He was still hiding. He was still paying for his peace with my banishment. Instead of breaking me, their silence became my fuel. I realized that trauma is a fire. It can either consume you until you are ash, or it can temper you until you are steel. I chose steel. By the time I reached 29, I was no longer the frightened girl who had walked out of the country club in the rain. I was a senior forensic investigator at one of the top financial compliance firms in the Midwest. I lived in a bright, modern apartment overlooking the city skyline, owned a tailored wardrobe, and possessed a reputation among corporate attorneys for being unshakable on the witness stand. I had investigated multi-million-dollar embezzlement schemes, exposed fraudulent nonprofit executives, and recovered stolen pensions for elderly fraud victims. I loved my work because it provided what my childhood had been entirely denied: objective truth. In a courtroom, a mother's dramatic speech meant nothing. A charming smile meant nothing. Loud assertions meant nothing. Only the records remained standing when the noise cleared. I thought I had put Eleanor Vance in my past. I believed I had built a wall high enough between my old life and my present reality that she could never touch me again. But I had forgotten that narcissists don't stop when they destroy you. They simply move on to larger targets. The cream and gold trap. The package arrived at my corporate office on a Tuesday morning in early May. It hadn't been mailed to my home address. It had been delivered directly to my firm's executive reception desk via overnight courier, proving that my mother had been monitoring my career advancement from afar. It was a heavy, linen-textured envelope colored in cream and gold leaf. Inside was an opulent, custom-engraved invitation that radiated high society vanity. Mrs. Eleanor Vance requests the honor of your presence at the solemnization of her holy matrimony to Mr. Richard Sterling. Saturday, the 14th of June, at 11 o'clock in the morning. Grandview Estate, Historic District. Tucked inside the ivory card was a smaller, handwritten note from Eleanor's event coordinator. The handwriting was smooth, practiced, and cold. Victoria, your mother has graciously included you on the guest list for her special day. It is time to put past misunderstandings behind us and show our community that our family stands united. Your presence is expected. I sat at my mahogany desk, staring at the gold foil lettering. Richard Sterling. I knew that name immediately. Richard Sterling was a 62-year-old widow, a prominent commercial real estate tycoon, and one of the most politically connected developers in the tri-state area. His family had built half the historic downtown district, and his private equity firm managed over $50 million in commercial holdings. My mother had managed to pull off the ultimate social climb. After divorcing my father, she had positioned herself in high society charity circles, presenting herself as a refined, wealthy, independent woman who had bravely survived an unfortunate first marriage to an incompetent, financially ruined husband. Now, she was marrying into regional royalty, but I knew Eleanor too well. She didn't send me that invitation out of maternal love or a desire for reconciliation. This was a calculated strategic maneuver. In high society circles, rumors travel fast. If Eleanor hosted a grand wedding to a billionaire developer and her only daughter was noticeably absent, awkward questions would be asked. But if the difficult, estranged daughter appeared, smiled for the photographers, and stood quietly in the background, it would serve as public absolution. It would prove to Richard Sterling and his wealthy peers that Eleanor was a forgiving, saintly mother who had benevolently welcomed her troubled child back into the fold. My first impulse was to feed the invitation directly into the cross-cut shredder beside my desk. I had no desire to step foot into her world again. Then, 3 days later, fate intervened through my firm's work pipeline. Our managing partner called me into the executive conference room. A major regional bank had retained our firm to perform emergency financial due diligence on a pending $30 million merger between Sterling Development, Richard Sterling's firm, and an international investment consortium. As part of the merger requirements, Sterling Development had to clear all secondary encumbrances and corporate guarantees attached to its historical property acquisitions over the past decade. "Victoria," my partner said, sliding a thick blue binder across the glass table. "I want you to lead the document verification team for the historical land titles. There's a set of property transfers from Ohio, acquired by Sterling Development 8 years ago, that has some weird accounting flags. We need an expert pair of eyes to verify the original chain of custody." I opened the binder. My eyes scanned down the list of corporate acquisitions, land parcels, and deed transfers. And there, listed under Section 4, Paragraph B, was a parcel named Grandview Park Estate, formerly held by Vance Heritage LLC. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned to the back of the file, pulling up the digitized state land registry records and corporate tax filings connected to Vance Heritage LLC from 9 years prior, the exact month I had been driven out of my family home. As I analyzed the signatures, notary stamps, and corporate resolutions, the horrifying reality began to unspool before my eyes. 9 years ago, Eleanor hadn't just stolen $400,000 from my father's operational accounts. She had orchestrated a massive, systematic asset-stripping scheme. She had forged my father's signature on a corporate consent form declaring Vance & Associates insolvent. Then, she had used my forged signature as corporate secretary to transfer the family's primary real estate asset, a 10-acre historic property worth nearly $2 million, into Vance Heritage LLC, an entity entirely controlled by her. 6 months after I fled to Chicago, Eleanor sold that stolen land parcel to Richard Sterling's development company for $1.4 million in cash. She had used that stolen $1.4 million to purchase her luxury sports car, finance her high society charity memberships, and present herself to Richard Sterling as an independently wealthy businesswoman of immense means. She hadn't just framed me to hide her theft. She had used my stolen identity to finance her social ascension. And to make matters worse, I discovered that one secondary line of credit, a $300,000 guarantor line used to pay for the deposits on the Grandview Estate wedding itself, was still active under the original holding account, bearing my social security number and a freshly forged signature dated just 4 months ago. She was using my credit identity to pay for her second wedding. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the high-definition scans of my mother's handwriting, side by side with my forged signature. 9 years ago, I was a terrified 22-year-old girl standing in the rain with $94 in my pocket. But I was no longer that girl. I was a certified fraud investigator holding the original deeds, bank routing logs, tax filings, and felony forgery reports. I picked up my phone, called my attorney, and prepared a black leather document case. The shadow of Grandview Estate. The morning of June 14th was clear, sunny, and deceptively beautiful. Grandview Estate stood on a sprawling hill surrounded by ancient oak trees, manicured boxwood hedges, and wrought iron gates. Vaulted glass arches reflected the morning light, and crystal chandeliers hung from high timber ceilings in the open-air rotunda. Valet attendants in gold-trimmed vests parked luxury sedans, while a live string quartet played classical arrangements near a marble fountain stacked with champagne towers. Over 200 guests filled the courtyard: senators, judges, corporate executives, and the entirety of my mother's extended social circle. I stepped out of my car at 10:30 in the morning. I wore a tailored, floor-length dark emerald dress that exuded quiet, absolute authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, professional chignon. I wore no elaborate jewelry, only a silver watch given to me by Clara when I passed my forensic board exams. Tucked securely under my left arm was the black leather document case containing 3 certified copies of the forensic audit, original land registry deeds, municipal shelter stay records, and a formal identity theft report filed with the state prosecutor. As I walked across the marble courtyard toward the rotunda, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Aunt Evelyn, dressed in a lavender lace dress, dropped her champagne glass slightly, her eyes widening in disbelief. My cousins stopped laughing mid-sentence, staring at me as if a ghost had just materialized on the terrace. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like cold wind. "Is that Victoria? She actually had the nerve to show up? Look at how she's dressed. She doesn't look ruined at all." I ignored them entirely, walking with deliberate, calm grace toward the grand staircase. At the top of the marble stairs stood Eleanor Vance. She wore a custom-made ivory silk gown encrusted with pearls, holding a bouquet of white orchids. She looked breathtaking, polished and utterly regal, the triumphant queen of her crafted universe. When her eyes locked onto mine, her smile froze for a fraction of a second. A flash of raw, cold panic flickered across her features, a tiny crack in the porcelain, before her training took over, and she adjusted her face into an expression of warm, dramatic maternal grace. "Victoria!" Eleanor called out loudly, her voice carrying across the marble courtyard so every guest could hear. "Oh, my darling girl, you actually came! Look, everyone, my daughter has returned to us. I always said that a mother's heart never closes its doors." Several elderly ladies near the fountain dabbed their eyes with napkins. "What a saint," one whispered. "After everything that girl put her through." Eleanor glided down the marble steps, her silk gown rustling softly, and extended her arms to embrace me for the benefit of the photographers standing near the staircase. As she pulled me close, her arms stiffened. She didn't hug me. She leaned her lips right against my ear, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying whisper that chilled the air between us. "You insolent little bitch," she hissed, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and gin. "How dare you dress like that in my house? You wipe that smug look off your face, you smile for these cameras, and you sit in the back row. If you say one word to ruin this day for me, I will make sure you are blacklisted from every firm in this state. Do you understand me?" 9 years ago, that voice would have reduced me to tears. 9 years ago, my chest would have tightened with suffocating panic. Instead, I looked down at her. I looked at the heavy makeup hiding the lines around her eyes, the desperate tension in her hands, and the tiny bead of sweat forming near her hairline. I realized with absolute clarity that she wasn't powerful at all. She was a frail, terrified imposter, standing on a trapdoor of her own making. I stepped back out of her grip, keeping my voice cool, clear, and perfectly audible to the guests standing nearby. "I didn't come to take photos, Eleanor," I said, holding her gaze. "I came to ensure the accounting is settled." Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the marble floor behind her. My father, Arthur Vance, stepped out from the library doorway. He looked 10 years older than his age. His hair was completely white, his shoulders were hunched, and he wore a rented tuxedo that hung loosely off his frail frame. When he saw me, he stopped dead in his tracks. His lips parted, his eyes filled with sudden, overwhelming tears, and he took a hesitant step forward. "Victoria?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Victoria, my God, look at you." "Arthur!" Eleanor snapped, turning on her heel with sharp authority. "Get back inside. You need to check the seating charts." My father froze. His eyes flicked to his wife, his shoulders slumping back into that familiar, heartbreaking posture of total submission. He looked at me with an expression of profound, crushing shame, took 2 steps back, and vanished back into the shadows of the library. I didn't feel anger toward him anymore. I felt only a quiet, solemn pity. He had chosen his prison long ago, and he was still sitting in the cell with the door wide open. The library audit. At 10:45, 15 minutes before the organ was scheduled to play the wedding processional, I walked past the event coordinator and stepped directly into the private mahogany library off the main rotunda. Inside the library stood Richard Sterling. He was putting on his boutonniere in front of a gilded mirror. Standing beside him was his eldest son, Richard Jr., a sharp 35-year-old corporate attorney who served as chief legal officer for Sterling Development. "Mr. Sterling," I said, shutting the heavy oak doors behind me. Richard Sterling turned around, brow furrowing in surprise. "Yes? Can I help you? The ceremony is about to begin in a few minutes. My name is Victoria Vance, I said calmly, stepping toward the large mahogany desk in the center of the room. I am a senior forensic auditor with Vance Financial Compliance in Chicago. I am also Eleanor Vance's daughter. Richard's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. Ah, Victoria, your mother mentioned you might be joining us today. She told me how complex things have been between you two over the years, but I'm glad you made the effort to. Mr. Sterling, I interrupted smoothly, unzipping my black leather document case. My mother gave you a story to explain my absence. I am here to give you the audit connected to your company's pending $30 million acquisition. Richard Jr. immediately stepped forward, his legal instincts flaring. What are you talking about? What audit? Before I could answer, the library doors flew open with a bang. Eleanor burst into the room, her pearl gown swaying wildly, her face red with fury. Richard! Get her out of here, Eleanor shrieked, her voice dropping all pretense of elegance. She's sick. She's mentally unstable. She's been obsessed with ruining my life ever since her father and I divorced. Security is on their way. Eleanor, quiet, Richard Sterling said sharply, lifting a hand. His tone was not angry, but it was authoritative, the voice of a man who managed boardrooms for a living. Let her speak. I laid 3 thick, neatly tabbed document folders onto the mahogany desk between Richard Sterling and his son. Folder 1, I said, opening the first blue tab. This is the corporate resolution for Vance Heritage LLC, dated 9 years ago, transferring the 10-acre Grandview Park estate from my father's firm to my mother for 0 financial consideration. Page 4 bears my printed signature as corporate secretary. I pulled out a second document from the same folder. This is a certified court transcript and municipal intake ledger from the city of Chicago, proving that on the exact date that signature was notarized in Ohio, I was residing in a women's emergency shelter 500 miles away with $94 to my name. The signature on that land transfer is a felony forgery. Eleanor's face lost every drop of color. That was just an administrative shortcut, she stammered, stepping toward the desk. Arthur agreed to it. We were consolidating family assets. Folder 2, I continued without missing a beat, opening the green tab. This is the escrow settlement statement from Sterling Development 8 years ago, when your firm, Richard, purchased that land parcel from Vance Heritage LLC for $1.4 million in cash. The funds were not placed into a business asset account. They were wired directly into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands under Eleanor's maiden name. Richard Sterling's eyes narrowed into hard, terrifying slits. He leaned over the desk, picking up the wire transfer receipts, his eyes scanning the routing numbers, bank codes, and corporate entity declarations. As a veteran developer, he recognized the mechanics of money laundering instantly. She presented those funds to you as her personal, independently earned family wealth, I said quietly. In reality, she stole the land from her husband, forged my identity to clear the title, and used your own acquisition money to fund the lifestyle that brought her into your social circle. You lying little snake, Eleanor screamed, lunging across the desk to grab the folders. Richard Jr. stepped between them, firmly catching Eleanor by the wrists and holding her back. Don't touch those documents, Eleanor, Richard Jr. warned, his voice cold as ice. Richard, look at me, Eleanor pleaded, tears finally breaking through her makeup, streaming down her cheeks. Look at me. I love you. I did everything for us. She's fabricating these papers because she hates me. Tell him, Arthur. Tell him she's lying. My father walked into the library. He stood near the doorway, watching his wife sob, watching the folders on the desk, and looking at the daughter he had abandoned 9 years ago. The room fell into an agonizing, suffocating silence. The faint sound of the string quartet outside, playing the pre-processional music, filtered under the oak doors. Richard Sterling slowly looked up from the bank slips, turned his eyes toward my father, and spoke in a voice that was deathly quiet. Arthur, you were the primary partner on that deed. Did your daughter forge that signature? Or did your wife? The broken silence and the collapse. My father stood frozen under the weight of Richard Sterling's gaze. For 9 years, Arthur Vance had lived as an invisible man. He had let his daughter be cast into exile, branded a thief, and humiliated in front of an entire town, just so he wouldn't have to face Eleanor's wrath. He had bought his daily peace with my destruction. He looked at Eleanor. She was glaring at him with eyes full of desperate, violent command, silently ordering him to lie, ordering him to save her one last time. Then, Arthur looked at me. He looked at my emerald dress, my calm eyes, and the silver watch on my wrist. He saw that I wasn't shaking. He saw that I was no longer afraid of her. Something inside my father broke. Or perhaps, for the first time in 60 years, something inside him finally mended. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, lifted his head, and looked Richard Sterling directly in the eye. "Victoria didn't forge anything," my father said, his voice loud, clear, and steady. "She didn't steal a single penny. Eleanor forged Victoria's name on the corporate filings. She forged my name on the bank releases. She threatened to drag me through court until I was homeless if I ever spoke up. I let my daughter take the blame because I was a coward." "Arthur, shut up!" Eleanor shrieked, striking her hands against Richard Jr.'s arms. "You ruined us! You ruined everything!" "No, Eleanor," Arthur said, turning to her with an expression of profound, quiet grief. "You ruined us 20 years ago. We were just too terrified to admit it." Richard Sterling stood up straight. He smoothed his jacket, folded the forensic audit papers carefully, and slid them into his internal coat pocket. He looked at Eleanor Vance not with anger, but with absolute, irredeemable disgust. "The wedding is cancelled," Richard Sterling said coldly. "Richard, no!" Eleanor wailed, sinking toward the floor, grabbing at his sleeve. "Please, we can fix this. We can talk about this after the guests leave." Richard pulled his arm away from her grip as if touching poison. "Richard Jr., call our corporate legal counsel immediately. Instruct them to freeze all pending asset transfers connected to Mrs. Vance and file a formal fraud notification with the State Land Registry." Richard Sterling turned, walked over to the double oak doors of the library, and threw them wide open. Outside, in the grand rotunda, 200 guests were sitting in golden Chiavari chairs, waiting for the bride to walk down the aisle. The string quartet had just finished their song, and an expectant hush had fallen over the room. Richard Sterling stepped up to the edge of the second-floor marble balcony overlooking the rotunda. His voice echoed clearly off the high timber ceilings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice devoid of emotion, "I apologize for the inconvenience, but the ceremony scheduled for today will not be taking place. The event is cancelled. I ask that you all please exit the estate immediately." A collective, deafening gasp surged through the 200 guests. People stood up from their chairs. Whispers erupted like a tidal wave across the courtyard. "Cancelled? What happened? Did you see Richard's face?" Eleanor rushed out of the library after him, stumbling over the long train of her ivory silk dress. "Richard, wait! Please!" she screamed, her voice cracking before the entire crowd. She reached the top of the marble staircase, but her heel caught on the hem of her pearl gown. She gasped, flailing her arms, and tumbled down the last 4 steps, landing heavily on the cold marble floor at the base of the staircase right in front of the front row guests. Her tiara snapped off, rolling across the stone floor. Her bouquet of white orchids shattered, petals scattering everywhere. A glass of red wine dropped by a startled guest near the terrace spilled across the lap of her pristine ivory dress, staining it a deep, bloody crimson. Eleanor sat on the marble floor, gasping for air, her hair tangled, her face smeared with mascara and red wine. She looked around the grand room, desperately reaching out her hands toward the people she had spent a decade trying to impress. "Evelyn! Help me," she whimpered, looking at her sister. Aunt Evelyn looked down at her, shook her head in utter disgust, turned her back, and walked briskly toward the main gates. Eleanor looked at her high society charity friends. They pulled out their mobile phones, taking hurried photos while turning away to leave. Eleanor looked at my father. Arthur stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at her one last time, before turning around and walking out the back entrance of the estate alone. Finally, Eleanor looked at me. I walked slowly down the marble staircase, my emerald dress swaying gently, my black document case held securely under my arm. I stopped 3 feet away from where she sat on the floor among the ruined orchids and spilled wine. "You said beauty skipped me, Eleanor," I said quietly, my voice carrying only to her. "You said warmth skipped me, and loyalty skipped me, but you forgot one thing." She stared up at me, her mouth open, shaking with impotent, frantic rage. "Truth didn't skip me," I whispered, "and unlike your lies, my truth doesn't require an audience to exist." I turned my back on her, walked out through the grand wrought iron gates of Grandview Estate, and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. The architecture of freedom. The legal fallout from that day was swift, public, and absolute. With the forensic audit delivered to the state prosecutor by Richard Sterling's legal team, a formal criminal investigation was launched into Eleanor Vance's financial transactions. Facing multiple counts of felony forgery, grand larceny, and corporate record falsification, Eleanor was forced to sign over the remainder of the offshore funds to satisfy a civil restitution order in favor of my father's retirement estate. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, she accepted a plea deal that resulted in 3 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent criminal record. The high society world that had been her obsession abandoned her entirely. Her charity board memberships were revoked, her name was removed from local committees, and the grand house she had rented was put back on the market. She moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, living on a modest state pension, completely isolated from the community she had once ruled through fear and deception. My father spent the next 3 years working quietly to make amends. He sold his remaining business equipment, paid off his debts, and moved to a small town 40 miles outside Chicago. He opened a modest woodworking shop where he restores antique furniture for local families. We didn't instantly pretend those 9 years of betrayal had vanished. We didn't share a dramatic, cinematic reunion. True healing doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens through consistent, quiet accountability. My father calls me every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. He doesn't make excuses for his past silence. He listens to my life, asks about my work, and tells me he is proud of the woman I have become. For the first time in my life, I have a father who treats me not as an extension of his comfort, but as an independent human being worthy of respect. As for me, I didn't take a single dollar from the financial restitution order. I didn't need it. Instead, I used my own savings to establish the $94 Foundation, an emergency grant fund at the Chicago Technical College that accepted me when I first arrived in the city. The grant provides immediate microfunding to young adults who are forced to leave abusive, controlling households with no financial support. It provides them with a bus ticket, a safe place to sleep, and legal aid to protect their credit identities. People often ask me if going to my mother's wedding that day was an act of revenge. I understand why they ask. To an outsider, watching a grand wedding collapse and seeing a tyrant fall on a marble floor looks like vengeance. But revenge requires hatred. Revenge requires you to obsess over the person who hurt you, spending your time and energy constructing a trap to watch them suffer. I didn't manufacture my mother's consequences. I simply stopped holding her lies together. I documented her actions, presented the facts to the people affected by her deception, and allowed the weight of reality to do the work. Boundaries are not punishments. They are the conditions under which you permit people access to your life. Accountability is not cruelty simply because the person facing it happens to be your mother. For 9 years, I believed that leaving my family had made me the daughter who broke our home. The audit taught me that I hadn't broken anything. I had simply stopped holding the cracks together with my own silence. My mother's greatest punishment was not losing Richard Sterling, losing her social standing, or falling on that marble floor. Her greatest punishment was losing the power to define reality for me. My victory was not proving her wrong. My victory was walking away from that estate, stepping into my life, and knowing that my name belonged entirely to me. If you have ever been forced to carry the blame for someone else's deception, tell me your story in the comments below. Where are you listening from today, and how far has Victoria's journey traveled to reach you? Thank you for watching this complete narrative on the silent Valkyrie. Remember that you never have to set yourself on fire to keep an abusive family warm. The truth does not require your anxiety. It only requires your patience. Stay grounded, value your integrity, and never let anyone rent space in your life who demands your silence as payment.